let's create a database in SQL Server 2000. This is where we actually get down to using our database and causing some things to come into place. I have a couple of options here. First of all, we can use the Enterprise Manager to create our database. We can use the Query Analyzer. And then everybody's favorite, we can use the wizard to bring about a database. Let's look at some examples of each of these. First of all, on creating a database with the Enterprise Manager, if I go to the SQL Server Enterprise Manager, we will let this thing open up, and we'll see how to create a database through the graphical user interface of the Enterprise Manager. I'm going to expand my Microsoft SQL servers, the server group. And then notice I'm going to expand databases. I'm going to right-click here and say New Database. So I click on New Database, and again I right-clicked on Databases. I got the flyout menu, then I left-click on New Databases. And I'm going to set this up, and I'm just going to call this Class Test. And so I type that in, and notice I can set my data files. Here's the file name. I can click on the little ellipsis box button and go out and tell it where exactly I want to have this database reside. And notice I can spread it even if I want to across multiple locations and even give it a different file name. I'm not going to do that right now. And notice I can also set file groups if I have multiple file groups. Notice I can set all my parameters here. We're going to talk about those in the next video. Transaction log. The same thing. I can tell it where to put the transaction log, and I can set an initial size. Now back on the original database, I could set this same function, but if I want this to be 3 megabytes from the get-go, I can just make the change here. Likewise here, this one's going to be 3 by default. I can change it to 5. And then when I finish, I just say OK, and notice I get the little hourglass. My hard drive spinning. I'm creating this database. It's called Class Test. And notice here it is. It shows up in my list now. I just created the database. Now I'm going to expand the database and show you something kind of interesting. If I expand the tables, I haven't created a table yet. But notice all these with owner DBO and a type as system. This is my system catalog, or my database catalog. These are the tables that SQL automatically sets up to use to manage my database. So that's one way with the Enterprise Manager. The other way, or one of the other ways, is with the Query Analyzer. Now if I click on Tools, come down to Query Analyzer, this is the shortcut to Query Analyzer. Now I want to point out I can get the Query Analyzer as well by doing Start, Programs, SQL Server, and choosing Query Analyzer. And I don't have to go through Enterprise Manager, but since I'm here, I'll use that. Now, anytime I create a database, I'm going to use the master, and I can just type Create Database. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it QA Example. That's the name of my database. Weird database, I know. I'm going to come up here to the Execute Query button, and notice F5 will work as well. I'm going to left click on this button, and notice this went away and the red button for stop has come up. And notice it ran, it created a database. Now it's interesting that I didn't have to tell it anything else. SQL will default to everything else. So the defaults come into play here. Notice a couple of defaults we can see right away is the size, 3 megabytes and 0.75 megabytes. Notice it set up a 3 megabyte QA example database and a QA example underlying log database. It created my transaction log for me automatically without me mentioning it. That's the Query Analyzer. I'm going to close that. And then the last way to create one, and probably everybody's favorite, notice you'll have to click somewhere down here on your server or on the databases, go to Tools and choose Wizards. Now, if you ever try to open Wizards and it's not there, let me see if I can do this. Notice you don't have Tools here. There are some places you can be in here that the Wizards won't show you the database. Well, I can't make it do it simply because I want to. If it's ever grayed out, then you just need to click somewhere over here in the left side of the box to get in the right context. But I'm going to choose Wizards, expand Database, and then you'll notice we have a Create Database Wizard. If I click that and then say OK, I get my wizard, and now I'm just going to answer questions. Notice I'm going to type the name in here, and this is going to be the wizard example database. Notice my database file location. I can browse out and tell it where to put it. Transaction log file location. If I want to put it on a different physical drive, I can do that by putting it on my C drive. These are logical, so it's not going to help me a whole lot here. Next, my database files. I can specify the name of one or more files which the database is contained, and I need to specify the initial size. I'm going to make this one 4 megabytes in size. Next, these are some parameters we're going to talk about with file growth in a few minutes. The transaction log files, where do you want those and what do you want the size to be? I'm going to change the size to 2 here. Again, parameters on the transaction log as well. And then complete. I click finish, and notice I'm getting the wait hourglass. And notice the database was successfully created. And we'd like to create a maintenance plan. We'll talk about that later on. Actually, talk about it in the admin class. But if I go out and look at my databases, here's my wizard example database out here. And notice system tables show up for that. So the third way of creating a database. Databases are surprisingly easy to create here. Now let's take a closer look at the transact SQL command that we use. First of all, if you saw in the example, if you remember, I didn't have to type anything other than create database in the name. This is the logical name that I'll use to communicate with this database. In transact SQL, there's a lot more options that I have. All of them tells it what file group to put it on. Now, I'm just going to put it on the primary file group. We'll talk about that later. Then I give it another internal name, sales_dat, and this tells me that's the data. File name, I put a lot more information in here. We're going to go over this in the next video. But you'll notice the syntax for this gets rather large and somewhat intimidating. And I would refer you out to SQL Books Online. If you go out to Books Online, we were out there a little earlier, and we looked at the create database statement. I would highly recommend that you go out here and print this out. Do a search on create database. I'll have to type it all in. Notice I'm on the index tab here. Double click, go to the transact SQL reference listing, and notice there's quite a bit of information about the create database statement. And they even have a lot of examples. Print this out. Some more links to go to find some other things. Print this out, and from time to time read over it before you test. And this will help you with creating a database. Databases are surprisingly easy to create. There's just a lot of options you can choose. And in the next video, we're going to take a look at some of those options when we talk about database parameters.